relationship and kind of lost faith in God and my religion at the time, and it just kind of steered me down the wrong path. Ended up, in the hospital, that whole thing, did that from not overdosing, but just from taking a little bit too much of a lot of different things. So I ended up in the hospital. She broke up with me. We went our separate ways. I decided I needed to kind of clean up my act a little bit, and never went to treatment or anything. But I decided to enlist in the military. Thought maybe that would be a good answer. So one of my friends happened to come back from Afghanistan. He was in the Army. He was a Army Special Forces Green Beret, and we had very similar personalities. And he said, "You ever thought about joining the Navy?" And I said no. Well, I wanted to join the Marines out of high school, but I wanted to chase the baseball thing, so instead. But he said, "You should go be a Navy SEAL," and I said, "All right, it sounds like fun." So I did that. Joined the Navy, went to boot camp, went right from boot camp into BUDS. It's basic underwater demolition SEAL training down in Coronado. Got all the way through all 3 phases, was in SEAL qualification training, and sustained another injury. And this time I had been away from the OxyContin for about 2.5 years, and wasn't really drinking a whole lot except on the weekends. We'd go out, but during the week we were so consumed with training it wasn't feasible. But once I got injured from this fall that I took, they put me on OxyContin again, and this time it was in the military, and I had a pretty much endless supply of it. Anytime I went to the doctor, I just asked for more, and he refilled it. And at one point we counted, and it was like 300 pills a month that I was on for a little bit of time. And then one day they just cut me off and said no more. And unfortunately my body was pretty used to that amount of substance in my system, and I sought it out. So I found it in San Diego, and was able to supply my habit again, and got out of the military, medically retired, and knew I needed to kind of clean it up again. And I had a wife at the time who's now my ex-wife, and she kind of pushed me into it, said you need to get going to treatment or whatever, or else I'm going to leave you. So I did, and kind of the rest is history. And that was about 2.5 years ago. And then through different things that have led me to different places, I ended up in Palm Springs one day doing some business work that I was doing with some marketing in another company, and had a good day and decided to go grab a bite to eat. And it was like August. There was nobody in this town in August, and it was 115 degrees, and just happened to stumble upon a restaurant that my girlfriend right now is working at, and had like a late lunch, early dinner. She was my server, and asked her if I could leave her my number, and I did. I wrote it down, and it was funny because I didn't even have a pen. I don't even know that people still write down numbers anymore, but tracked down a pen, and I remember looking at it going, all right, this is perfect. I have horrible handwriting, but I was like, she'll be able to read this. And she didn't call me that day, so I was like, oh man, that sucks. But I just kept praying about it and thinking about her and manifesting it. And like 2 weeks later, I got a text that said, is this Dan? You have horrible handwriting. I was like, yeah, it is. So eventually I was kind of commuting back and forth here on the weekends, and we just decided it'd be easier for me to live here. So I'm glad that I'm here. Every single thing that's happened to me in my life has led me to this exact moment, which I couldn't be more grateful for. And meeting all these new people through Mark and Liz that happened to come into a restaurant that I was working at, and it's wild if you look at every single thing that had to happen in order to put me in certain places that God has, put people in my life where I've been, fortunate enough to be put into other people's lives, and that's really what it's all about for me now. I used to live a life of self and thinking, why do all these things happen to me? But it's great because it's given me a cool story that I can bring and help other people with. And really, that's what I'm finding now. It gives me more joy than any of the material things or financial opportunities that I've been blessed to have. But that's about all I got. Is that good?
That's a lot. That's great.
He's a great guy. He's from Seattle, Washington. He comes from a Russian family of Jewish people. And, I'm sure you can imagine what kind of tug of war he would be in, trying to, fight for his life and his struggles to be a Christian man. And I met him coming here through treatment and getting out and going to sober living, and he was one of the first people I met. He was my buddy on the buddy system, and through that whole stay there, he's just been a powerhouse example of leading someone the right way, and he's just a good guy. He's the person that led me to this Bible study to sort of create a family here. Yeah, he's just an amazing person. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks,
All right, Pastor David, is that good for today? Or
Yeah, I think so. We got Mark up there and he's
right.
teaching.
Both Daniels are people that have tremendous ability. And that ability can be used for good, which is what they're doing now, and that ability can be used for bad, which they've done in the past. We've all done it, not just them. But I think it's so awesome. And I like to think when someone has gone through a tremendous struggle, something that the world thinks is a negative, I really see it as a positive, because I think you're both really equipped to be a resource to other people and help guide them through life. So I think it's a tremendous blessing. It's hard to think about going through something extremely negative as being a blessing, but in the rearview mirror, I really think it is. So you guys are awesome. I'm really proud of you. That was a good move, bro. So tonight, I want to talk about the wise and the fool. The wise and the fool. In the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon says in chapter 10, verse 2, a wise man's heart directs him toward the right, but the foolish man's heart directs him toward the left. We talk a lot about wisdom and we talk a lot about foolishness. We use it in everyday speech. Well, he's a wise person, or she's a wise person, or what a fool that person is. And I thought it'd be good to delve into that a little bit to try to understand what the terms mean, and then to biblically look at what a life means when it's lived either in wisdom or in foolishness. So the definition of wisdom, kind of the exotic definition, is the soundness of an action or decision with regard to the application of experience, knowledge, and good judgment. So Mark's interpretation of that is it's the application of knowledge in a way that produces a desired outcome. So wisdom is different than knowledge. Knowledge is information, but just because you have information doesn't mean you have wisdom. Wisdom comes by applying knowledge through experience to reach a desired outcome in whatever you're doing, including in your own life. Now, when Solomon, who was the third king of the united Israel, the son of David, when he became king, after he had been inaugurated, he and God had an interesting discussion. In 1 Chronicles 1, verses 7 and 10, we're told, in the night God appeared to Solomon and said to him, ask whatever you want and I shall give it to you. So imagine that, someone coming to you and say, ask me for whatever you want, and God can do it. He can deliver. It's not like me saying, ask whatever you want and I'll do it. God said, ask me whatever you want and I will do it. This is what Solomon said. Give me now wisdom and knowledge, that I may go out and come in before this people, for who can rule this great people of yours? So what Solomon asked for was wisdom. Solomon asked for wisdom. And when you read the writings of Solomon, he was a very wise person. The book of Proverbs, talk about wisdom literature, is amazing when you study the book of Proverbs. With these little pithy verses in Proverbs, there is so much wisdom that can be applied to your entire life. So Solomon asked for wisdom, and God gave it to him. God gave it to him. Now God also gave him great riches. He didn't ask for those, though, but God said, I'll give you the wisdom, and while I'm at it, I'm going to give you vast wealth. So unfortunately, although we may try to be wise, we're imperfect people, and sometimes we're very foolish. So the other side is foolishness. And a fool is someone who is unwise, lacks sense, and lacks judgment. Kind of the opposite of a person with wisdom. Now, a fool may have knowledge, just like a wise person may have knowledge, but the difference is in how they apply knowledge. The fool is unwise, lacks sense, and lacks judgment. But fortunately, there's a cure for foolishness. And tonight we're going to look at wisdom and foolishness in 2 or 3 contexts and see if we can understand the cure for foolishness. Now I want to look at this in the context of the lives of 2 men of the Old Testament, Abraham and Lot. Abraham and Lot. Lot was Abraham's nephew. When Abraham was called by God to leave Ur and go wherever God told him to go, God didn't tell him where he was going to send him. He just said, go where I tell you to go. And Abraham obeyed, and Lot came with him. And they traveled together for a time. And this story that we're going to study tonight, I think demonstrates wisdom and foolishness in the lives of these 2 men. Now, Abraham was originally named Abram, and Abram means exalted father. But when God gave the promises to Abram, he changed his name to Abraham, and Abraham means father of many. And you can kind of see where that's going, because in Genesis 17:5, God says, your name shall be Abraham, for I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. So Abraham was really the first guy, and he became the father of a multitude of nations. And so God changed his name to prophesy his destiny, which God often did in the Bible. He would rename somebody to prophesy what that person's destiny would be. So, I mentioned Lot. Abraham's nephew, Lot. Lot means covering. And I thought that was odd. What does that mean? So I did a little research. And Abraham's father was Terah. Terah was not a believer in the one true God. He was a pagan. And when Terah became aged, Lot was assigned to care for him. And so that's why Lot's name means covering, because he was a covering for Terah. And as I said, Terah passed away. Abraham took Lot, and they left Ur, headed for the Promised Land. So our text tonight is in the book of Genesis, chapter 13, and we're going to do verses 2 and 5 through 18. I'm going to read them, do a little context, and then we'll dive into the verses. There's some very interesting things in here. So verse 2 in chapter 13. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And now 5 through 18. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. And the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling in the land. So Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, I will go to the right, and if to the right, then I will go to the left. So Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give you to you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Strange story. So in the context of this story, we're going to look at three elements of wisdom. One is how wise people handle conflicts. How wise people handle conflicts. Number two is how the wise view life. They view it from an eternal perspective rather than a short-term perspective. And we're also going to study how it's wise to place confidence in God. So we're going to look at three elements of wisdom, and I'm going to try to make the case that wisely settling your conflicts, wisely viewing life, and placing your confidence in God's promises are wise, and they'll serve you well. Now there's 13 chapters in the book of Genesis devoted to Abraham, and 5 of those are devoted to Lot. So that's a lot of material in the book of Genesis. 13 chapters dealing with the lives of these two men. When I see that, there's a reason for it. God does not engage in idle acts. There's a reason for it. There's a lot to be learned by the lives of these men. So Abraham's story, as we'll see, is a story of success, whereas Lot's story, his life, is a story of failure. And so let's see what we can learn from their lives. Going through verse by verse. First, I want to talk about verse 2 and then verses 5 through 9. Verse 2, Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. And the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between them, the herdsmen of Abram's livestock, the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling then in the land. So Abram said to Lot, please, let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right. Or if to the right, then I will go to the left. So these guys were living large. They were in the southern part of Israel, in an area known as the Negev. And I want to tell you how they got rich. Although Abraham is referred to as the friend of God throughout the Bible, Abraham's riches were ill-gotten riches. He acquired his wealth in Egypt. There was a famine in his land, and he took his wife, Sarai, and went down to Egypt where there was food. And Sarah was a beautiful woman, and he figured out that if people know that I'm her husband, they're going to kill me, and they're going to take her because she was such a beautiful woman. And so he convinced her to lie and to participate in the party line that she was his sister. And so they go to Egypt, and Sarah, Abraham's sister, catches the eye of Pharaoh. Pharaoh takes her into his house, makes her his wife. So Abraham gives his wife to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh was so enthralled with her that he gave Abraham, it's in verse 16 of chapter 12, therefore he treated Abram well for her sake, and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels. So Abraham became rich by basically pawning his wife off to Pharaoh. But he became rich. And Lot was his trusty sidekick. He probably shared the wealth with Lot. So this is how they became rich. So it's good news for all of us We all have many chances with God. We make a mistake. Even the great Abraham made a mistake, more than one mistake. And God always forgives and blesses us, thankfully. So because the wealth consisted of flocks and herds, there was an issue of space. These herds needed to be watered and they needed to be fed. And after all, they were living in a desert. So because there was competition for the available water in this desert and the available grazing land in the desert, the herdsmen of Abraham and the herdsmen of Lot were in competition for it. And that competition led to conflict, serious conflict. So the point there is that wealth can be...
Let me just say, he got his wife back. Right?
Minor point. Yeah. Not the point of the story. He did get his wife back.
She was in on the lie too.
All right.
Yeah. No, she would say this is a sordid story. This is a sordid story. Okay, thank you. Footnote, he got his wife back. So the point is that wealth can be both a blessing and a curse. We were just talking about that at the dinner table. So here you got two guys that are incredibly wealthy for their times, and all that wealth led to was competition and conflict, strife between them. Important point to keep in mind as we chase after wealth. More wealth, more problems. And wealth, we've seen it, can divide families. So wealth can be, as I said, both a blessing and a curse. So in verse 7, in the midst of all this strife, there's a change in focus. And it says, now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling then in the land. And I asked myself, what does that have to do with anything?
That's their competition. Why fight amongst themselves? You gotta
Well,
deal with other enemies, you know.
Was that just to demonstrate that they weren't the only ones in the land that were fighting over the land?
well, I think what it was is that God allowed them to demonstrate their strife in a situation where they were being watched by unbelievers. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were pagans, and they were in the land, and they were checking these two men of God out, duking it out. Their conflict was in full display of the unbelievers to relish. And the point in my mind is that we're all being watched. Those of us that call ourselves Christians, we are being watched by the world, because the world is ready to judge us. And we have to mind our P's and Q's, because our behavior, especially when we're under stress, will either draw people to Jesus or it'll repel them from Jesus. And I think we know of examples of both cases, where the behavior of Christians have drawn people to Jesus and the behavior of Christians have repelled people from Jesus. Think about it. It's very, very prevalent. And I think when believers have unresolved conflict, it hurts the testimony of the Lord. And that's what was going on here. There was definitely conflict. So now verses 8 and 9.
Mark,
Yes?
interrupts. We were talking about my friend Amaya, right? This is funny. So at this point, when college, she was not a Christian, right? So we're walking across campus, and she's railing against Christians. I mean, she is bad mouthing and blah 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 blah. And all the way through, and I looked at her and I said, "I'm a Christian." She's like, but that was the start to help her later on become a believer.
Yeah. Yeah. So people are watching us. People are watching us. And that's kind of a sober reminder to me, because when I'm operating under stress, I don't always carry myself with grace. And it does hurt the testimony of the Lord.
Yeah.
What, Daniel?
God is watching, you know.
Yeah.
You know, I would hope that I don't, people can help it, that I don't go out and say that God, people are watching me. I know that's, you know, that whole setting the example rather than living like God is watching.
Well, if
I
we're
get it.
concerned about what God thinks about us, we'll conduct ourselves properly in front of others as well.
Yeah.
So this is how the strife is handled in this case. Verse 8. So Abram said to Lot, "Please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right, and if to the right, then I will go to the left." So point number one, Abraham took the initiative to resolve the conflict. He saw a conflict brewing and he didn't just let it drift. I know frequently when I'm in conflict, it's easier just to back away, let it drift, let it fester until it's intolerable and then the explosion occurs. But Abraham took the initiative to resolve the conflict. He didn't let it drift and he didn't take a hard line. He didn't say, Lot, well, what did Sanford used to say? I made you, I'll knock you out. He didn't say that to Lot. He said, please, we're brothers. Let there not be strife between us. He actively surrendered his personal rights to Lot. So he was the big guy. He was the richer of the two guys. And yet, he surrendered his position to Lot, the impudent nephew. So what he did is talked about by Paul in Philippians 2:4. Do not merely look out for your own interests, but also for the interests of others. He was looking out for the interests of Lot and surrendered his own interests to Lot. Now, there are times, and this is a controversial statement, but there are times when people must separate for the sake of peace. They separated here. Believers, even believers, will not always see eye to eye. There's a great story in the New Testament book of Acts. Paul and Barnabas were partners on the first missionary journey, and they got to a point after the first missionary journey and said, let's go on a second missionary journey and let's revisit all the places we visited the first time and see how they're doing. Well, Barnabas wanted to take along John Mark, who was a young man. He'd accompanied them on the first journey, but he got homesick or something and cut out on him in the middle of the journey. Paul didn't want to take Mark. And what the book of Acts says is that Paul and Barnabas had a sharp disagreement over whether John Mark was going to accompany them. And it was so sharp that they decided for the sake of peace they had to separate. So Paul went on the second missionary journey with Silas, and Barnabas went on his own missionary journey with John Mark. So even in the lives of believers, there's a time when they must separate for the sake of peace. Because if they don't, they're going to kill each other. They're going to just destroy each other. So also in verses 8 and 9, I want to go back to what Abram said. He says to Lot, please, let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. For we are brothers. So wise people exhibit tenderness, even under stress. Abraham, the big guy, demonstrated great tenderness. Wise people don't burn bridges. Don't burn bridges. They diffuse anger, so they don't perpetrate anger or perpetuate it, and they don't fight back. They don't fight back. I'm sure Abram was the big guy, and his herdsmen outnumbered Lot's herdsmen. They could take him out, but he didn't do it. He surrendered to him. It takes two to fight. Abraham wouldn't tangle. Verse 9, is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I'll go to the right. If to the right, then I'll go to the left. So Abraham's saying to him, you choose. You go where you want to go, and if it's to the right, I'll go to the left. If it's to the left, I'll go to the right. So the point here is that wise people trust God for the right outcome. Trust God for the right outcome. Now, in chapter 12, as I alluded to a moment ago, God had promised to make Abram a great nation. And he believed that promise of God. So he was willing to surrender his rights to Lot and let Lot choose where he was going to go, knowing that no matter where Lot went, Abraham would still be in the will of God and that promise would be fulfilled, whether it was in the desert in Canaan or whether it was in the well-watered Jordan Valley. He trusted God to deliver despite the accommodations he made to Lot. Now, this way of thinking in my mind is really the basis of biblical generosity. When the Bible tells us to be generous, what it's in effect telling us to do is to be wise and put our trust in God. And if we put our trust in God for our provision, we don't have to hold on to our assets, to our money, to our possessions. We can have a loose hand. And that's what Abraham had. He had a loose hand with Lot. He gave Lot the first choice, knowing that God would make it all right. People that believe God's promises don't have to be selfish. It's kind of a refreshing thought. That's why Abraham gave Lot the first choice. So now we go into verses 10 through 12. So Abraham makes the accommodation and says, go anywhere you want. You choose and I'll go the other way. So in 10 through 12, Lot responds by, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. And then there's a little sort of parenthetical. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord. So it was like the Garden of Eden.
It was right.
Like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from one another. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. So there's a deliberate contrast between Abraham and Lot in these verses. Abraham, as we said, gave Lot the first choice, and Lot took it. Lot chose for himself, in verse 11, the valley of the Jordan. First he lifted up his eyes and he saw how beautiful it was and said, I want that, I want that. It was well watered by the River Jordan. It was like the Garden of Eden, and he chose for himself ahead of Abram. He did not extend to Abraham the same accommodation that he was given. His attitude was, what's in it for me?
So should they have liked Jordan?
I think Lot saw the Jordan Valley as a place where he could increase his wealth, and I think he was taken by that. He was taken by that. So in verse 11, we're told that, so Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. And it's interesting, if you go through the book of Genesis up to this point, every time someone journeys eastward in the book of Genesis, he's separating from God. So it's a poetic almost. He journeyed eastward to the valley of the Jordan and separated himself from God. And you know, I want to contrast where Abram was in Canaan, which was a much more arid area, and the Jordan Valley is beautiful. It's gorgeous. It's verdant. The Jordan during the spring, I mean, it's just full of water. It overflows its banks. It's well watered.
What would have Lot?
You gotta say it louder.
What would have Lot and Abraham done? I mean, if Lot wasn't so selfish and didn't just see everything for himself, I mean, would have like the most, or I don't know. I mean, is this like kind of demonstrating like that, you know, rather than separating and being selfish, that you should all work together?
Yes.
I mean, is that I'm trying to see, like, I don't know, I'm asking myself, I'm like, well, what if Lot wouldn't have been selfish? I wonder what would have happened, you know? I'm kind of asking myself that, but
They would have worked it out. They would have worked it out. I think this story is given to us to show us what falls out of selfish behavior.
okay.
Yeah, and I think that's the point of the story, and that's why Lot is the selfish characteristics of Lot are emphasized. But had he not been selfish, it would have been like two guys going through you first, no, you first, you first, no, you first. I think they would have worked it out.
You think they would have worked it out, huh?
Yeah, I think they would have worked
That's
it
the whole
out.
point you were just mentioning, how even the two Christians, like Barnabas and Paul, I think.
But the story emphasizes the selfishness of Lot. So the story isn't designed to show us how they worked it out, because they didn't work it out. But
I guess that
Wouldn't
was
you
just
say
my
that was
imagination.
also, sorry. Wouldn't you say also that he's choosing the easier life? Because in the Jordan, he doesn't have to take his herds very far.
Right.
You can just kick it,
Closer.
enjoy yourself.
Pretty-
you know. You
pretty
don't have to work so
selfish
hard.
decision.
I think it's as much that as the selfishness and the choosing the easier, which is the lot of our lives.
good point. Good point. So it's interesting to me, and I've said many times, that God's economy is upside down. It's completely the opposite of the way the world looks at things. The world would say, go Lot, pick the better. Abraham, you're going to the desert? What's up with you? And yet, obviously, Abraham was a life story of success, whereas Lot was a life story of failure. So things are not always as they seem on the surface. So, interestingly, in verse 12, we're told that Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Why that? Why? Who cares? And moved his tents as far as Sodom. I think that's there to demonstrate to us that once our direction is set, our destination is determined. He moved his tents toward Sodom. This is the subject of a whole other Bible study, so I won't go into it. But Lot eventually moved into Sodom. He moved his tents first toward Sodom, and then inched closer and moved into Sodom. And as the book of Genesis later tells us, Sodom was not a good experience for Lot and his family. It was not a good place for them to be.
It's almost like one kind of
Gotta talk louder, Aaron.
it's almost like one selfish decision kind of influenced him to make
A lot of
bad decisions.
Yeah.
So it could have been stopped before it even got started. I mean,
Yep.
I don't know. I look at that as like in my life, like something that's so insignificant at the time. I'm like, oh well, this ain't a big deal. You know, like I can do this. And then I realized, oh man, I made that one little seemingly insignificant decision that was selfish, and then it led me to make this huge decision that kind of really had an impact on the outcome of my life, you know. I don't know, I'm seeing a lot of relevance in this.
One of Mark's quotes that he's always said to me is, if you don't want to enter the room of sin, don't sit by the doorway of temptation.
Yeah, you know, Satan waltzes us right into problems, and it always starts a little. He's a good dancer. He dances us right into trouble every time, and that's what was happening here. That's what was happening here. He loved the cities of the valley, pitched his tents near Sodom, and then got a little closer, and then moved into Sodom. Peter, in his second epistle, at 2:8, says this about Lot. This is kind of a bird's eye view of what Lot's life was, later life was. Speaking of Lot, for by what he saw and heard, a righteous man, while living among them, made his righteous soul tormented day after day by their lawless deeds. So he lived a life of torment in Sodom. He made a series of bad decisions, and while Peter refers to him as righteous Lot, he also clearly says that he lived a life of torment, being tormented day after day by the wickedness of the people of Sodom. So, the next point is Lot chose his occupation over his family. This is the second contrast between Lot and Abraham. The first contrast is, as I said, that Lot chose himself over Abraham. But Lot also chose his occupation over his family. And how many times have we done that? I've done that many times. Probably many of us have. We put business first. It's the most important thing. Lot had flocks and herds, and he chose a good place for them. After all, he lifted up his eyes and saw the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan. He's thinking, this is where I want to be. My herds will like it. They'll flourish. This will be good for business. But unlike Abraham, Lot never called on God for guidance, never called on God for wisdom. We're told that Lot chose for himself the valley of the Jordan. He didn't consult God. He didn't consult anyone. He chose for himself the valley of the Jordan. He never asked, at least we're not told he ever asked, well, is this a good place for my family? He never asked, will this place draw me and my family closer to God?
He never asked his mentor Abraham, like, what do you think would be
What do
best
you
for
think,
me?
Abe? Yeah. Lot was driven, this is a very esoteric point. I think Lot was driven to these bad decisions by the old formula of Satan, going back to the early chapters of the book of Genesis, and discussed by John in his first epistle in 2:16. It's a recipe for disaster always. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. I think that's the recipe that Lot followed in making this decision. The lust of the flesh, the valley of the Jordan, was watered, well watered everywhere. He looked at it and said, this is where I want to be. The valley of the Jordan, good for business, lust of the flesh. Lust of the eyes. We're told in verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan.
What
And-
about, Aaron's, when Aaron started thinking about working together, and I'm thinking, I told Liz, I said, well, how convenient. Abraham didn't tell him a little secret about the wonderful benefit he's going to have from God. So, they could have combined, and he could have brought Lot in onto an amazing thing. Did he?
He could have. He could have. There was one physical problem here. This is basically an arid land, and these guys had enormous herds. And we're told in the earlier verses that there wasn't enough space to contain both of the herds. So it was a situation where the separation was almost a forced separation. And I think it's presented that way for a reason. There are certain relationships that just don't work for various reasons. Ray.
Also to that, what Daniel was speaking about, Abraham basically knew his destiny, and if he did propose it to Lot, in the way that he proposed it to Lot, Lot elected to go in separate ways, so that was his destiny was to be with Abraham, but he was separated anyway, he went with Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that Abraham already knew his destiny, so when he proposed it to Lot, if Lot was supposed to be a part of his destiny, then Lot would have just said, I'll go away with my cattle or whatever the case may be, and I'll journey on.
That's right, because God had already laid it out for Abraham, as reported in chapter 12. So the third element of Lot's folly was the boastful pride of life. In verse 11, so Lot chose for himself. Lot didn't need to consult Abraham. He didn't need to consult anyone. Didn't need to consult God. He chose for himself. And he probably thought, what an opportunity. I'm going to put one over on old Uncle Abe. If he's dumb enough to go to the left, I'm going to the right. I'm walking through the door. How many times have we done that in our lives? People call you a fool for not doing that, but God calls you a fool for doing that. God's upside down economy. The other contrast between Abraham and Lot was Lot's behavior evidences his failure to view his decision from an eternal perspective. He viewed it from a short-term perspective. I'm going to go to the valley of the Jordan. It's well watered. My herds are going to do great. I'm going to make money. Where Abraham was looking from an eternal perspective. He had received the promises of God. He knew he was going to be the father of a great nation, and his descendants were going to be greater than the dust of the earth. He knew what his future was on an eternal basis. But Lot made a short-term decision. Now, interestingly, Lot made his own bed, and he had to sleep in it. His wife died in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 18 and 19. He offered his daughter, two virgin daughters, to the men of Sodom in Genesis 19. Maybe he learned that from Abraham, who offered his wife to Pharaoh. And Lot ultimately, with his two daughters, he ultimately engaged in an incestuous relationship with his two daughters, and they had children by their father. Really bizarre, really bizarre. But once again, I think this is to demonstrate to us that when our direction is set, our destination becomes certain. He made some unwise, foolish decisions, and Satan waltzed him right down the line to disaster.
But didn't the daughters initiate that? I mean, they
Yeah, the daughters
They got him
initiated
drunk and
Yeah.
took advantage of him.
Yeah, he was drunk, and they said,
He had to take the wine.
yeah, that's right, he had to take the wine.
That's right.
He was responsible. Nobody was their idea. They were afraid they wouldn't have children. There wouldn't be any men left.
Right.
It's weird, isn't it? But that's how the story goes. So, what this all demonstrates to me is that wise people tend to view things from an eternal perspective and not just from the standpoint of short-term gratification. And then finally, at the end of the passage, verses 14 and 18, the third point is that wise people have confidence in God's promises. Now, God spoke to Abraham and gave him his promises. And we might say, well, God hasn't spoken to me lately. I don't know what my promises are. But you do. They're right here. And if you study the scriptures, you'll see all the wonderful promises that God has made to all of us. And as wise people, we should always have confidence in God's promises. So that's the third point, and that's exemplified by verses 14 through 18. 14, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So I think this points up that the only thing that really stands in the way of God's blessings is our own disobedience. I think Abram trusted God's promises, followed through, and he received the blessing. Lot, who I'm sure knew those promises, I'm sure Abraham told him what the promises were, but he chose maybe the easier route, the selfish route. So his human disobedience got in the way of his receipt of the divine blessings.
I guess what does that mean? You know, when I hear that, I hear that as being a worldly promise. You know, at that moment, like you're being offered a clan of many people. I don't see the greater meaning in just if I don't know the Bible or the context. So he's being offered a not God's. You know, you say God's economy. That's a worldly promise.
Yeah, I think
that's a motivator.
I think what it is God is right. You got to remember, at that time there was no nation of Israel. You know, there were diverse nomadic people. Abraham was from Ur, a pagan area. So there were no Jews. There was no nation of Israel. And I think what God was promising, and remember, Israel was a theocracy, and Israel is a type of I guess we would call it heaven. It was God's land for God's people, much like heaven is for us. And so when God's making him the promises to make him the father of many nations and to make his descendants as numerous as the dust, I think he's making a spiritual promise. He's saying, I'm going to create a godly, a holy country for you, and you're going to be the father of that country.
But back to Abraham and his pimping off his wife.
I think they use that in here too. Pimped off his wife to Pharaoh.
Did she have any kids by the Pharaoh?
We're not told that she did. Doesn't appear she did. And later on, when she was quite aged, she laughed when the angels of God said that she would have a child by that time next year. So she didn't.
So she never had any children then?
Never had any children up until
she got old.
Yeah, until she was old.
Mark, can I just say something about the land?
Yeah.
You know, in the beginning, God gave land to Adam and Eve, not as a possession, but as a place to dwell with him. And so the promise for Abraham is a renewal, really, of the Garden of Eden, where I'm giving you a land where I will dwell with you. And ultimately, in Christ, now that land becomes our very selves, where God dwells in us. We become the land. So the use of land in the Bible is deeply spiritual, because it's about dwelling, not about owning. It's about dwelling.
Yeah, it's about entering the rest, and it is a spiritual concept, although it's tangible, obviously. But the land has a deep spiritual significance in the Bible. So, God made 3 promises to Abraham, and Abraham wisely was obedient and received the blessings. These are the 3 promises. In verses 14 and 15, all the land that Abraham could see would be given to him and his descendants forever. Forever. In verses 15 and 16, he would give Abraham descendants as numerous as the dust of the earth. And it's interesting because these promises are being made to Abraham when he's in his 80s. He had no children at that time. And God's promising him children. It takes faith verse 16, and that Abraham's descendants would be innumerable. So not only was he going to have one son, but through that one son, he was going to have descendants as numerous as the dust of the earth. These were promises that God made to Abraham's face. God said, this is what I'm going to do. But I think it still took incredible faith for Abraham to receive those promises. Because after all, although God gave him the land was, we're told in the earlier verses, it was under the control of the Canaanites and the Perizzites. So it wasn't fully available to him, but it was given to him. And in verses 10 and 11, the leftover grazing land Lot took. So Abraham took the less desirable land. So for that to be his land for him and his descendants forever, to me that took great faith, because it wasn't, from a worldly standpoint, an ideal location. And as I mentioned earlier, he had no children. Later on, I think it's in chapter 18, when the angel of the Lord appears and predicts that this time next year Sarah's going to have a child, she hears, she's in the other room preparing a meal, and she laughs. And the angel of the Lord, which is typically thought to be Jesus in his pre-incarnate state, says, why are you laughing? And basically she says, I'm in my 80s. How am I going to have a child next year?
You know, Mark, one thing we don't know is that when you said they went to Egypt, we don't know when they left Ur going to Egypt, when they went back, maybe they already seen the land.
Yeah.
I mean, it's right through the area, you know. I don't know
Yeah.
when they went from Sinai, how they got to Ur, but you'd have to travel through that area. Maybe they had already seen what.
Maybe they had.
They had already gone to the promised land
So-
before they went to Egypt.
Yeah, they'd gone there and there was a famine, and that's why they went to Egypt.
Yeah. The famine wasn't in Ur.
No, the famine
Famine
was
was in Canaan.
in Israel, Canaan.
And Canaan, right. So in verse 17, God instructs Abraham to stake his claim to the land. It's kind of a neat verse. It says, arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. It's a very symbolic legal gesture. I'm giving you this land. I want you to walk about through the land and inspect it. You know, it made me think that maybe each one of us should walk through the land that God has given us. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's an apartment, maybe it's a tent, I don't know, but we should walk through that land and be thankful for it. Inspect it. Savor what God's done for us.
Maybe we should walk through our lives and be
Yeah.
thankful for that.
I agree. I agree.
And certainly the promised land is eternally with God in heaven, right? So that's when we set our mind on things above, we recount what heaven is like. It's like walking through the land, and this is the promise of where I'm
Right.
going. Yeah.
But
So-
isn't that the way people used to, I mean, even in America in the early days, when you took out a land stake, you walked off your claim.
Right,
So,
and
it's
that
the
was
same
actually, they would deliver possession of the land through some of these ritualistic acts. But I think that's a neat statement. Arise, walk about the land through its length and its breadth, for I will give it to you. So he's saying, inspect it. Take a look at what I'm going to give to you. And then finally, 18, Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So the point in 18, I believe, is that although Abram was very flawed, he was a man of faith. He built an altar in Hebron. So remember, he gave the good land to Lot. He let Lot take it. So he takes Canaan, the more arid area. And what does he do? He builds an altar. I think by building the altar, he's saying, I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know what you're up to, God, but I'm going to trust you. I'm going to worship you. I'm going to make it work here because I have an eternal perspective and I have confidence in the promise that you've made. Now it's interesting, Hebron in Hebrew means communion. And I think that's very fitting because the one thing Abraham was, appears many times in the Bible, including Isaiah 41:8, he was a friend of God. So he went to Hebron, which means communion, and built an altar and carried on his friendship with God. So, what does this all mean? It's all interesting, but what does it mean to us? So I think there's a few things that are important takeaways. One, God's arithmetic is not like ours. What Abraham did from a worldly standpoint was stupid. But it obviously was wise. So I guess it depends on what measuring stick you're using. I'll go with God's measuring stick. Although it may not seem wise, it's always wise. We can't see the end from the beginning like he can. So it also tells us that Lot walked by sight. He was a man of the flesh. He looked at the well-watered valley. He thought about how it was going to enhance his business, and he went for it. He went for the gusto. He was looking for a city that was built with human hands. But in the end, although he took the choice land, he lost everything. Abraham, on the other hand, walked by faith. Important contrast. Whereas Lot looked for the city that was built with human hands, we're told he looked at the cities of the Jordan and pitched his tents near Sodom. The book of Hebrews, in chapter 11 at verses 8 through 10, tells us about Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. God said, go to a place that I will show you. And he said, I'm in, and went without knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So Abraham, unlike Lot, who had a very worldly perspective, short-term perspective, he had an eternal perspective. He was looking for a city whose architect and builder was God. He was focused on the great eternity, whereas Lot was focused on the next season of raising his herds. You know, when we walk by sight and subtract 1 from 1, we have nothing. But when we walk by faith and we subtract 1 from 1, we have everything. It's crazy. It's crazy. Jesus makes this point in Matthew in chapter 19. He says, and everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or fathers or mother or children or farms for my name's sake will receive many times as much and will inherit eternal life. That's this upside down arithmetic that God works in our lives. So, in conclusion, I think we should think about this, and we should make an effort to emulate Abraham, not to emulate Lot. And there's 3 small ways that we're told about in this passage tonight. Is resolve conflicts wisely and graciously. I think that's a great lesson to take away. Hard to do. I get angry at people and I want to punch them out. I don't want to resolve things graciously and wisely, but we have to. We have to. We owe it to God to be wise in that way. We also have to be wise by viewing our life from an eternal perspective. Not to be too focused on what's happening to me today, but to be more focused on where I'm headed and what the long-term picture looks like. And of course, the ultimate long-term picture is eternity in heaven with God. And then finally, we have to have confidence in God's promises if we're wise. If we're wise, we'll keep our eyes out on the horizon. We'll understand what those promises are. And no matter what happens, we'll keep pushing forward toward the promises of God. They're certain. It's just they're a lot clearer to him than they are to us, and that's the element of faith. The book of Hebrews, we're told that faith is the hope of things not seen. I know. What is it? It's in 12:1. It's awesome. I'm going to find it and read it. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the convictions of things not seen. It's the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. That's faith, and that's what Abraham was doing here.
Okay, I'm
Yeah.
kind of tripping out.
Okay.
I'd never thought about this before, but I think I've told you the story maybe. My dad was a builder, and he was a pretty successful builder in Riverside at a time when, in the 70s, we're building, these houses like in some of these areas was just very lucrative. And he built, occasionally he would have a partner, and twice he had a partner that he couldn't work with anymore.
Strife.
Strife.
Birds were conflicted.
Yeah, their herds were conflicted. Once in an apartment building and once in an old folks like apartment assisted living facility, big facilities. And the way he resolved it is he got both of them together each time. This happened years apart. And got the partner with them, and he said, "We can't go on like this anymore, but I don't want to lose the relationship. And let's flip a coin. And if you win, if
You
you
go to
get
the
it,
left, I'll go to the right.
you take it.
Yeah.
If I win, I take it." And he did that both times, and he lost both times. And so he gave away an entire apartment building, and gave away an entire assisted living facility both times. And still had a relationship with at least one of them, a strong relationship with one of the partners all the way through his whole life. And continued on. God gave him all the desires of his heart. He named a house that we lived in Indiana he called it Casa de Su Gracia, House of His Grace. And retired officially at 39 years old. He's now 83, and he still lives on what he made before he was 39 years old. I mean, he's had passive things that he's done since then, but he has always lived that life believing that he was going to be fine and that God had him. He loved the Lord, and he believed that God had him, and he always held things like this.
God has our back.
He was wise.
He
was wise. It wasn't that he frittered things. He was a very, careful, and he was a good steward of things, and yet he held them like this. And I never really thought about those two stories in life.
Yeah, I'd really like he patterned that after Genesis chapter 13. It's awesome. I knew about the story, but I never thought about it in those terms. I just looked at it and thought he was
Crazy.
Had bad luck. Maybe it was a two-sided.
He's coming here this week.
They were heads on both sides. Yeah.
You always hear the pastor, and you do the same thing, which is read the Bible. We're always saying read the Bible. To me, this is the epitome of it. You talk about promises. How do you know what promises God has for you if you don't read it?
Right.
And so it's not to know the information, it's to know the promises and then to live by them. But
Right.
we get lost thinking, I don't understand this or anything else, but you got to say, I got to know all the promises. It's like knowing that there's a treasure map and not reading it. That's why you want to read it.
And I think that's why God gives us stories in the Bible,
Yeah.
because that makes it easier for us to relate our lives to those promises.
Exactly.
And it's really awesome. I agree. When I came to the Lord, I was fortunate enough to get involved in a Bible study that I was in for 7 years, and there was nothing else I did that drew me closer to Jesus than being in that Bible study and reading the Bible daily through that 7-year period. So I can't recommend it enough.
Thank you.
Okay.
I got something.
Yep.
One more, just a minute.
Yeah.
Is that why I'm so content that ever since I lost everything in a fire, I still haven't found a home? Because I see the promise and I feel it and I see God working behind it.
Yeah. If you see those things happening, that's
Yeah.
exactly why you're content.
Yeah, everybody opens their doors to me and it's
Yeah.
just amazing.
It is.
They're, I call them family already.
It is amazing. It is amazing. Sometimes things are a real burden. What did Janis Joplin said? Freedom's just another word for have nothing left to lose. And that's kind of a prophetic statement, because when you have nothing left to lose, you are free.
Yeah, that's true.
Nothing owns
I feel
you.
so free.
Prophetess Janis Joplin. Okay, thanks.